on the paper, email me and I'll send you a PDF copy, right? That you can read for sure. But also you can use your notes from class and help you sort of make sense, because that was a particularly difficult article. And the uh, the close reading response will not be based on whether or not you fully understood it, but rather how you're wrestling with it, okay? And your ability to sort of begin to engage with the issues, right? And I realize that even though this is a 400 level class for many of you, this is the first time you've seen art history. So, okay. Asher Durand, you remember, was one of these people who was closely associated with Thomas Cole. One of the things we'll see today is the degree to which Thomas Cole was a very monumental figure in American landscape painting. That he did, in fact, set the stage for most later landscape painters in one way or another, especially the generation that immediately followed him, because remember, he died prematurely, right? When he died in 1848, it was a surprise to everybody, right? It was seen as a tragic, untimely death. So the remembrances of him and the legacy of him, when that sort of thing happens in general in culture, when somebody dies prematurely, right? It tends to be that the legacy becomes that much stronger, right? They didn't have time to come out with a crappy record, right? Because Kurt Cobain, Nirvana, right, casts this huge shadow across 90s music because Kurt Cobain killed himself, in 1993 before they only put out 3 records, right? And none of them sucked, right? So, when things get cut off prematurely, then, then the legacy gets that much stronger. Think about the Beatles breaking up after 10 years. How many bands are together now? The Stones are still together, and who listens to the new stuff? That's my analogy, right? So Thomas Cole's legacy was that much more strong by the fact that he was no longer with us, if you will, or with them. And Asher Durand, as we saw, painted an homage to him that was really very much trying to channel what Cole had been doing, which is, this figures on the precipice, this high drama, right, where you stand right on the edge about to fall in, that very sort of romantic power of nature stuff, right? Nature's grandeur, which we'll see in other artists as well. Durand, for most of his pictures, doesn't really do that, right? The majority of Asher Durand's pictures are much more sedate, where the landscape lays low, where your point of view still is elevated over the valley, but not in any kind of dangerous, precipitous way. And we're almost always confined to route from where we are down to the lowest level, right? A visual route in, if you will. And so we have a path beneath that bluff that the cows are on the left, or we can actually follow the cows on the right as they work their way gently, a series of mediated steps down to the lowest level, which is the water, right? So Durand, still Hudson River School, shares some of the issues that Thomas Cole shares, but the question is whether or not he shares them all. And one of the things that we saw with Cole, in addition to the drama, right, the romantic drama of his landscapes, was in many of his works a kind of a veiled commentary on progress, right? And the problems that he saw inherent in progress, right? And for him, man's place in nature, we were not moving in the right direction that way. We were not being sensitive to our place in nature. We were trying to control nature, which is itself a fool's errand, right? That's just, you can't. And so he would make paintings that were about that. The clear cutting in the Crawford Notch picture, right, was about the sort of us spoiling nature. His picture on top of Mount Holyoke, the oxbow, turns his back on progress, was really about the preserving of that site and trying to champion it as a site for preservation. The voyage of what do they call the voyage of life pictures, the 4 pictures of the human soul, were also seen as a metaphor for the nation, who is still kind of in its infancy, and a warning of the dangers that lay ahead as the nation reached maturity in old age, right? That don't have pipe dreams of grandeur and empire, right? Especially during a period of manifest destiny, right? That is a problematic venture. Right? So these pictures are all fraught with these ideas that industrial progress, and that's kind of what it is for him. That's why progress is so dangerous. It's his industry, right? Very much a change from older traditions. That industrial progress is something that he was quite wary of, right? And part of it comes out of being a Mason, right? And his interest in himself as a living stone being carved by God led him to his interest in nature as the great sculpture of God, right? And that we shouldn't be messing with that, right? So Durand, the question for Durand, who's so really kind of worships Thomas Cole, is whether or not that's the same. Does he share the same issues as Cole does? And so we certainly saw with the kindred spirits that Cole is pointing to the rocks, and there's that idea of immersing yourself in nature to learn, which we sort of alluded to in our reading. But with these images, these pastoral landscapes, does Asher Durand share that theme of encroachment, right? Of progress as mankind, civilization, quote unquote, encroaching upon nature, right? Encroaching is a foul in football, right? I don't watch football. I remember encroaching 5 yards, right? And that means you're getting too close. You're moving into somebody else's space. You don't belong there, right? And so Durand gives us images, and we'll see other artists today give us images of mankind moving into nature, but the question is whether or not the meaning is the same, right? Is it seen as something that's problematic? And so in this case, the cows lead us, if you will, the viewers, down to the edge of the water. And as we look across the water, we find that actually it's almost as if things coexist nicely. Houses nestled among the trees up on the top of the hill. A nice little sailboat on the water, right? The movements between areas gentle and sloping rather than precipitous and dangerous, right? To what degree is this then a symbol perhaps of a peaceful coexistence between man and nature? We have there's probably our single most strong reference to the presence of mankind in nature is that stone bridge, right? Serious piece of architecture, if you will, serious piece of construction. That might suggest industrial progress and encroachment, but we don't necessarily see that. No trains, for example. And what we do see is a man on horseback and another person on foot crossing that bridge. So it seems still in 1861, right? This is, granted, that's how most people got around, but there were in fact trains available that would lead people to these outposts, and that's not what Durand chooses to show us. So what we have instead is, I think, this idea of natural materials being used within that same setting, right? Where we get the idea of the stone from this area, just simply adding to the landscape, and not necessarily in a destructive manner, right? And with this, one of the things that we see with Durand, and we'll see this with other artists we look at today, are sort of this other theme that's always there with landscape. And with Thomas Cole, it was obvious with those 4 pictures about the voyage of the soul, right? The progress of life. And that is the idea that landscape is this metaphor for life's journey, right? The river starts small at a source. It grows with strength as it moves down course. Things add to it. It gets bigger. It gets stronger. It gets more sophisticated and complicated. And eventually it empties into the great beyond, which is the sea. And people for the longest time have thought about the river as a metaphor for life. And whether it's the flowing river and crossing rivers and landscape as a metaphor for life, right? But even when we think about things like ancient cultures, like ancient Egypt, that used the Nile as the burial, the dividing line between the land of the living and the land of the dead, and that when you died, you crossed the Nile, right? And you were buried on the opposite side. So this idea of rivers and landscapes as having this really strong metaphor for human existence, right, is something that we can find in every culture. Well, this is hyperbolic, but many cultures in many epochs, we find this to be true, where people will talk about going, Petrarch, the poet Petrarch, 1300, goes and climbs to the top of Mount Ventoux with a copy of St. Augustine in his pocket, and he sits down and writes a poem about what it meant to climb Mount Ventoux. Mount Ventoux is south of France, and from there he gets to the top. He can see all the way to Italy, which is where he's from, blah, 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 blah. But he talks about this fact that what happened to him when he was climbing is he understood what life was all about. He understood his passage through life by reflecting on his passage through space, right? Nature. So for Durand, right, these are certainly, I think, always there. That we can look at the kind of themes that he chooses to bring into his pictures. And you might say, well, maybe it was there. But remember that Durand is painting these in the studio, right? He goes out and he makes sketches so that you can recognize certain areas. But it's then cobbled together from multiple points of view in the studio. So it really is sort of like a still life, if you will. I want this, I want that, I want this, I want that. And he's making choices as to what goes into the picture. So the stone bridge, he may have had a sketch of a stone bridge, but whether or not it was right there in the composition as he saw it from this rise above the cows is another question altogether, right? It's a choice to have it there. In the same way that a painting, not a photograph, could easily have it wiped out, right? We could use Photoshop, but they can do it this way by just not painting it. So why is the bridge there? Is it a metaphor for crossing to the other side? Life's journey from one realm to the next. And we find in the history of landscape paintings that this is certainly often the case. That not only do we get these landscape elements used as themes of transition, but also then we get the landscape and its overall organization is giving us a high road and a low road, kind of biblical that way. Putting churches along the route, and we have one back there, to remind us that on our life's journey there are safe havens and sanctuaries, but on the other hand there are distractions and temptations, right? All of these things, if we spend enough time looking at these, we can begin to wonder whether or not, to what degree Durand is deriving these things. Because we've already shown how these artists, these American landscape artists, seem to be particularly enamored with Dutch landscape painting. And that's where we find the symbolism incredibly strong, right? So, right, there we are with that. I think we saw this as well. So now, with the tower on the side, that could conceivably be a chapel, couldn't it? Instead of a house back there. I'd have to talk to somebody who does 19th century American architecture to find out for sure. But we definitely have our path through nature, right? Through the darkness into the light. And you start to think of these metaphors of moving through darkness to light, moving through danger to safety, right? That there's more to landscape painting than a pretty vista, right? That they are laden with meaning in the same way that we talked about still life pictures, right? Or portraits, for that matter, right? That there are ways in which we can read the picture and find out more. Now, one of the other things is, before we leave Durand, such a bad slide. I didn't realize it was that bad when it was on my computer top. He did a series of what he called tree portraits, beginning already in the mid-1840s, where he would take the sketches that he had done outside and come back into the studio and then just draw these, which are just, all he wanted to do was to get the anatomy, if you will, I guess it's the botany of the tree, correct, right? And you can see that with each one of these, it really is about what is the bark, what's the difference in the bark and the foliage of the different trees that are here, right? He's immersing ourselves in it. And these are 2 feet tall, right? So they're not that big by comparison with some other things. And they're meant to be very immersive, right? They're almost a very different kind of immersion than we see with the open vista landscapes where we wander through them. Here we're surrounded by these trees, and so many of our American artists are interested in this level of realism. We should look at the one on the right because it's a better slide, right? To get that level of realism. And I'll try and find a better one of this and change the slide in the slideshow. For most of today, we're going to look at Jasper Cropsey, Jasper Francis Cropsey. Again, all these American artists have 3 names, and I think it's because many of the artists came from families of artists, and we need the middle name to distinguish them from each other, right? But it still makes them all sound like serial killers, right? John Wilkes Booth, right? And Jasper Francis Cropsey. Another member, if you will, of the Hudson River School. Now, remember, it's not a school. There isn't membership per se, but he's discussed as being one of the Hudson River School. And this is a fairly large picture. And whenever we see pictures that are big, we ought to take note because the artist is painting it big, specifically so that he can make a statement, right? He really wants to put something out there. And we've seen, starting with Cole, the degree to which landscape painters are trying to make landscape painting more broadly accepted and appreciated. Now, it was already appreciated amongst people, because populace, right? It was a popular kind of art. People liked it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be painting it at all, right? And it was being championed by the Art Union and by the National Academy of Design as having sort of, moral significance, being particularly American, right? But there were some critics that still said that landscape really was not an important art, didn't have status in the same way that history pictures did. And so what we saw with Thomas Cole was an attempt to sort of break landscape away from just being pictures and adding narrative to them, okay? In addition to that, Cropsey does that and then blows them up huge. This is almost 6 feet across, right? It's 67 inches. It's 5.5 feet across, right? So that's really huge picture, right? So big that there's no way he's painting it anywhere but in the studio, right? But it's a statement picture, right? Alton, you did a series of pictures for your senior project that were large, and you wanted it to be large because you wanted us to get into it, sort of have it absorb us. But I think also you were making a statement of sorts, right? This is a big issue. I can't make a big statement with a small picture, right? And when you do a landscape on this level, the part of that statement is landscape is important, as important as royal portraiture, which is huge. Right? And Cropsey's not the only one doing this, right? But he does. And we'll see even bigger ones yet, right? But back in England, already in the 1820s, the landscape painter Constable, John Constable, began to paint a series of 6-foot pictures. He called them the 6-footers. That would indeed elevate landscape to the appreciative level of other pictures, right, in the eyes of the critics, right? So for Cole, it's also the adding of narrative, right, that adds to that. And so that's what Cropsey's doing, okay? Now Cropsey, a couple of things, and we'll get into this. First, he began his career as an architectural draftsman. He actually had a full-time job drawing buildings for an architectural firm, right? So he trained as an artist, moved off to be an architectural draftsman for it. Ooh, I got a bloody nose. Sorry about this. Could you guys see this already? Okay, hang on a second. Let's do that. Hopefully I will be okay. I just got these pants last weekend. I'm gonna ruin them. It always happens to me. I buy a pair of pants, I love them, and I spill olive oil all over them or something. Okay. Began as an architectural draftsman, and in fact, our picture here reflects that interest. The castle, for example, so nicely drawn, right? And it's actually based on a real castle. We'll see that in just a second, right? He turned to painting in the 1840s, began painting landscapes. He was very much influenced by Thomas Cole, but he, throughout the rest of his life, continued to be an architectural draftsman to make money, right? That'd be a solid source of income. Why give up on that? So it's important to remember that, because as we look through his works, we'll see he's also interested in stone architecture, but for very different reasons than Thomas Cole was, right? For Thomas Cole, they were masons, right? The works of Freemasons. But for Cropsey, not only are their architecture, which is what he does for a living anyway, and thus easy for him, but also they would remind him of Thomas Cole, right? And in fact, this is such a close parallel, right? There's our Thomas Cole departure, that you can see it's just he's ripping it off, right? This is totally homage to Thomas Cole, right? And Cropsey was a huge admirer of Cole's work. He loved him. Both him and Frederick Church, who we'll look at today as well, just thought that Thomas Cole was like the greatest painter ever. And for anybody painting landscapes in America, that's certainly the case, right? The greatest American landscape painter. And for Cropsey, it was really kind of, he was kind of like a Cole worshiper. At one point, Cropsey goes to Rome just to study architecture, right? He's going to go to Europe, and most Americans did. They would make the grand tour, right? You go to Europe, you see all the great art. We don't have that many museums. There aren't any really, but there's the one in Philadelphia, right, with Peale, but the Met's not open yet, right? Philadelphia Museum's not open yet. There aren't museums here, so if you want to go see Rembrandt, you got to go to Europe, right? And he does, and he goes to Rome, which would make sense. If you're interested in architecture, where else are you going to go? And he actually seeks out and finds and rents the same room that Thomas Cole had rented when he went to Rome, right? So it's just this total kind of homage and following in the footsteps of the master, right? And in addition to that, Cropsey wrote like a 16-page explanation of this picture, which I'm not going to read to you, right? But in that, he says that he based this medieval narrative. You can see knights, just like Cole, moving through the landscape. And in fact, the overall structure, right? Just look at the structure of the picture. Castle on a hill, mountain in the clouds behind it, come down from that mountain and across a bridge, and then the path breaks toward the right but continues toward the left behind it, right? He blows some things up, some other things disappear, but it is exactly the same overall composition. To the point that if I showed you that as an unknown, you go, oh, that's got to be Thomas Cole, right? Because of that. And he acknowledged this, and everybody who saw this picture said, oh, it looks like Thomas Cole, right? And what Cropsey said was that in addition to sort of acknowledging Cole, he said that both Thomas Cole and I looked at the same piece of poetry to inspire the narrative, which was by Sir Walter Scott, who was writing these sort of medieval poems, right? And he said he used the same poem that Thomas Cole had used to inspire this. So all of this is homage to Cole. And it's important to remember that in 1851, Thomas Cole is only dead for 2 or 3 years, right, when he starts painting this. So that's a relatively recent event. And we should look at these homages as being an homage to the great departed master, right, carrying on his tradition. Now, at the time, by Cropsey's time, right, critics are beginning to say this is enough, right? Landscape painters should focus on landscape and stop doing these imaginary poetic scenes, and rather just focus on the truth of American nature. And that by doing that, the viewers can understand what's great about America and can derive the same sorts of moral lessons directly from nature that Cole and Cropsey, in this particular case, are giving them via poetic allegory. You don't need the poetic allegory to get the same message across, right? That's sort of what people are saying to Cropsey at this time, right? And so Cropsey actually does both kinds of scenes. He doesn't only do these Cole-esque images, but he in fact does things where he's focusing directly on a closely observed nature. He would keep his studio was in New York. He would go off in the summer, upstate New York, go sketch, right? And that means both pencil, pen, right? But also it meant oil sketches for small canvases that you don't expect anybody's ever going to see, so you can get effects of color and light and clouds and whatnot quickly, right? And bring those all back to the studio, and then just like Durand, just like Thomas Cole, cobble together the final composition based on these things that you've seen. And sometimes, often, they'll focus, Catskill Creek, for example, on a recognizable piece of topography or geography, right? But the point is not to describe that in a sort of geographical or topographical sense, right? It's not to recreate exactly what it looked like. The issue was to create what it felt like, the essence, the experience, which is often very different in memory from what we see. I mean, today we still think that, right? That our memories of things don't look the way that it really looks, right? And so if you were to go to Catskill Creek, you might be able to find that mountain and maybe that ridge, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to find that spot, that tree, those bushes, that rock, right? Because he's trying to recreate an experience rather than an observation, right? So he talks about this scene, and he says that what he was trying to paint was this a very wild and picturesque gorge, he says, which is now being flooded by Catskill Creek as after the rain. So we see the storm has passed away, red clouds of coming over the horizon, and in the aftermath of the rain that has just passed, the creek has jumped its banks, right, and is now rushing as a furious stream, he calls it. And this goes back to the thing we've been talking about with nature, right? For many of our landscape painters, nature is a force, right? And that the works of man are often diminished, dwarfed by the power of nature, right? And even with the Spirit of War, we have that sense. We have this pile of castle that's been built by man. And look at how he emphasizes the perspective on that, right? How high that is. But what does he do? He puts God's architecture dwarfs that, right? All the way up above the clouds, where man's architecture is quite literally below the clouds, right? So again, it's this idea of our progress, our work versus the work of God, right? And that's a very romantic way of approaching this. Now, that architecture was based on something that he actually saw in England. He had been to England in 1847, made a bunch of sketches in 1847, goes back to live in England for a while in the late 1850s, spends about 6 or 8 years there. And so the painting on the right from the National Gallery of Warwick Castle was done on his second trip to England, but he'd already been there and used sketches of that same castle, as you can pretty clearly see, are the basis for our castle in the Spirit of War, right? Not a direct quote, right? It's not meant to be Warwick Castle. It's meant to be a poetic, imaginary castle for this allegory that he's painting, but he's basing it on things that he'd seen. So our Warwick Castle is the basis of this. Right. Like I said, he wrote a 16-page document telling us what's going on in the Spirit of War. And I've got some great details to show you. He says it's an early dawn after a stormy and rainy night. He talks about the red sunlight of the dawn breaking through the storm clouds, how that rose-colored light, that pinkish light, colors both the architecture and the mountains, right? And you can see that he's really capturing that sense here. He mentions the jagged, wild mountains, the deep, thick, cold, the mists of the rainy night. Then he says that beneath the mountains is the dark vista of the valley underneath, promising an uncertain and gloomy future of warlike times. Right? So the distinction between the mountains up above and the dark gloom below is the spirit of war. Right? He mentions that the village in the valley is on fire. Right? The dark red glare of the burning hamlet breaks up against the mountains in the valley, while the enemies gathers around in ruthless idleness. The enemies on the bridge in front of the hamlet, in front of the town. The green and yellow banners are symbols for their jealous purposes. I don't know what he means by that, but he seems to think that even the color choices affect the meaning, right? Beacon fires blaze on the summit of the mountains, announcing the enemy's approach, right? So this is a city being laid siege to. Now, in medieval town architecture, right, the castle, the lord's house, is usually on the hill and fortified, where the city tends to be more open to attack. And in moments of distress, the gates would open and the citizenry could hide, right? If, in fact, the lord of the manor, if you will, is attentive, right? If they're not, they're in trouble, okay? He also mentions that in the cave on the right, and I don't have a detail to show this to you. I'm going to have to get down there soon and look at this. He says, in the grotto on the right is a wizard. So again, this is totally medieval fantasy, right? A wizard practicing his evil incantations in the grotto on the right. And all I can see are these little red glow inside that. So I need to get up there with the telescope and look at this again. I kind of always ignore this picture because I find it kind of silly. You know, I just find these sort of narrative landscapes not nearly, for me, as interesting as the natural ones. But that's just me, right? And I probably would have liked it a whole lot better when I was younger. I haven't figured out what's going on in the mountain in the background. You can see some flames rising up from it and some smoke against the clouds back there as well, right? He continues to tell us that the feudal castle, right, the stern face of defiance, that in its windows, as you can see, are glowing the light of the banquet hall, where the debauched knights and barons' vassals keep their midnight revelry. So he really wants us to be telling a very thorough story, right? As the city burns outside, right, again, illuminated by flame, inside, also illuminated by flame, are the people who are sworn by feudal law to protect that town, ignoring it because they're partying, right? And we see the light coming out of those stained glass windows and some people on the precipice. And a few of the knights have come out from the castle, right, to do their duty. Soon, he says, we see them fully armed, and here they come across the bridge. Right? Soon we see them fully armed and hear the sound of their horses' heavy tread. The goat herd shuffles his flock to the feudal court for safety. Can you see him back behind the knights? There's a shepherd with goats moving toward the bridge as the knights come out. Right? So he's going to run inside for sanctuary as this group comes out. And we presume then to work their way back to the hamlet that's in trouble. Right? A detail that's easy to miss between the trees, can you see that? There's a mother and child laying on the ground. And you can see the baby pretty clearly, right? The mother is that darkened form behind it. A mother and child have fled from their burning home, he said, and fallen exhausted by the roadside. Right? So this is all the coming of war, this battle between the enemy forces that have sacked the city in the background and the forces here. and some of the problems inherent within that in the foreground. Right? This was part of a pair, right? So he painted the two of them to be seen together as pendants. They were actually, National Gallery borrowed the one on the right. It's up in Philadelphia at a small museum there, and they reunited them for the first time in over 100 years back in the 90s, right? Or maybe 2005 they came together. The spirit of peace to go with the spirit of war. And I don't have details of this one to show you, but it's kind of interesting because, like Cole, right, it's this idea of this narrative landscape that extends across two canvases, so that one gives us one point of view, if you will, one theme, and the other one gives us a second theme. So Cole gave us the departure and the return, and Cropsey, war and peace. But it differs from Cole because it's not the same spot, right? It's not even the same spot over centuries. It's a totally different view in a totally different place, right? So peace is one place and war is the other. But they connect in other ways. The shepherd's back with the goats. The mother and child are back. They're picking flowers, right? The goat herd is just sort of wandering through the landscape in harmony with nature, right? It's paired, but in a very, very different way, right? He says, all the strife and all the incidents of strife have now passed away. There's a tomb in the lower right corner. Remember that Cole had things like that as well. He said that on the side of the tomb is a rude sculpture of a knight riding into battle. And in another compartment, the figure of death, burning torches and treading on the dead. So this is the aftermath of war, right? The folly of it, the destruction of it, symbolized by the tomb. But now that war is over, we, the people, have returned to a peaceful, harmonious coexistence with nature. He says, rising above it all is the temple of peace, occupying a commanding position over a fruitful country, a growing city, and an open sea, right? So it definitely means all of these things. Cities can now rise as opposed to being destroyed. They are now being built, right? The open sea versus the imposing rocks as alternatives, as opposites to each other, right? Now, the similarity between this and what Thomas Cole had done back in 1837 did not go unnoticed. You don't need art historians to tell you this. People, when they saw this, and again, remember, it's only a few years after Cole's death and 15 years after Cole's pair, they noticed right away the similarity, right? When this was shown at the American Art Union, remember the American Art Union? They were championing American painting, giving them a venue, right? Talking about the moral characteristics of American art. They said, Mr. Cropsey, who in many respects resembles Mr. Cole, has lately been carrying the resemblance a bit further by painting two pictures in that epico-allegorical style, right? So they knew right away that he's doing exactly what Thomas Cole had been doing before in paying homage to him, right? But again, keep in mind, this is just after Cole's death, and we shouldn't look at it as simple copying or lack of inspiration, but rather what Cropsey is doing, I think, with these pictures. And again, remember that each of them is about 6 feet across. So seeing them together is huge. But what he's doing is he's paying homage to his inspiration, right? What do we say, right? Copying is the sincerest form of flattery, right? Paying homage to his advisor, right? These were the biggest paintings he had done up to this point in his career, right? He had never painted anything as large as this. So there's two of them in 1851. And when he wrote about the pictures, he said that they weren't big enough. He said he was trying to express on canvas the highest intellectual expressions. He said, had I chosen a larger canvas, I might even have given more force to many of the points I'm trying to make, right? So even at 6 feet, he felt a little limited by how big it is. Now, he moved to London in 1856. We already saw Warwick Castle painted while he was in London, but again, remember, not painted on site. There's a drawing for that up in Yale, in the Yale University Art Gallery, where he has little writings in the sky that said, remember that the river was muddy, right? And making sort of color notations on site. And that was the basis for the painting that he did, right? But while he's in London, spends 7 years there, 1856 to 1863, Cropsey's living in London. Okay. He continues to paint scenes of America, in addition to adding to it scenes from London, right? And so our picture on the left, Autumn on the Hudson River, was painted during his period in London. And it is 9 feet across the base. It's huge, right? 108 inches, 9 feet across the bottom. So it is really a panorama that you can immerse yourself in, right? And what he's done going to London is he's not just doing it out of memory. He's got all these sketches. When we looked at Catskill Creek, we talked about the fact that he would go to upstate New York, make sketches on site, take them back to the studio with him, right? So now when he's gone to London, he's got this thousands of drawings, oil sketches that he can rely on and cobble together these scenes out of multiple views. And we can actually identify it. We know right where this is. This is Storm King Mountain. I've always loved the name Storm King Mountain. It's just it's north of New York City by about 50 miles or so, sort of between New York and Albany on the Hudson. And that's the mountain is there on the right, with the clouds rising over it. And when the Hudson hits Storm King Mountain, it actually widens out significantly. So it looks kind of like a lake or an ocean, but that's just the massive breadth of the Hudson as it flows past Storm King Mountain. Okay, so that much is identifiable. And again, it's based on these sketches that he had done. But like I said, it's absolutely huge. It's his biggest picture at this point in his career, right? 9 years after The Spirit of War, and almost twice as big, or at least half again as big as The Spirit of War, right? So an absolutely monster picture. We think that he kept making pictures bigger and bigger, not only to elevate the status of landscape painting in the eyes of critics in particular, but he's also trying to rival other painters. And in particular, he's trying to rival Frederick Church. We've seen Niagara Falls a couple times now, right? This is, again, a monster picture, right? 90 inches, 7.5 feet, 8 feet across the base, right? Cropsey's larger still. Church's painting of Niagara, just to fill this in a bit. When he finished it, he had a show in his studio. Now, this is pretty rare now, right? We don't have museums, except for Peale's Museum in Philadelphia. And the idea of seeing art is kind of changing in the course of the 19th century, really in Europe and in America. How do you see art? What's the experience of looking at art? And it's shifting toward the idea of exhibitions, temporary exhibitions of things. And so what Church did was he opened up his studio so people could come in and see Niagara Falls. And he charged an admission, which was kind of unheard of, right? People paid to come and see it. In D.C., we're spoiled, right? We don't have to. But the idea of paid admission to a museum is a relatively new idea, right? And there was nothing else in the studio to see except Niagara Falls. It was a one-painting exhibition. When I was an undergrad, the Louvre in Paris loaned the Met the Mona Lisa. They were doing some renovations. Met had it for like 4 months. And it was a one-painting exhibition. And there was a line like down the block and into Central Park, right, to go to see the Mona Lisa when it was there. Same idea here, right, a one-painting show. And people were crowding in. In 2 weeks, 100,000 people in 2 weeks, right? The Vermeer show that just closed had 350,000 people over 3 months. And it was pretty crowded, right? So it was a throng of people going to see this picture, paying, probably going back. And he gave them viewing devices, and this is kind of the cool thing about Church, Cropsey, others, Bierstadt, is the way that people viewed them is they would bring out little like opera glasses, little binoculars, and look through those at the picture. And what happens when you do that is it begins to look even more panoramic, right? Because the edges of the lens bend the picture slightly as the light passes through, right? And you get the same effect if you do this with your fingers and sort of look through that at the picture. And you can even do it here in class and get the idea of what it was like. People were having these immersive experiences with these paintings, right? Now, once Church's picture got done with its 2-week run in his studio, he realizes he's onto something here with this massive, entertaining picture, right, with these details we looked at. And he sends Niagara Falls up and down the eastern seaboard. And there's shows in Boston, right, in Baltimore, New York, right, up and down the seaboard, and everywhere it goes, it's a monster hit. And then in the same year, in fact, in 1857, it comes to London. And it's a monster hit there as well. It's such a big hit that after leaving London and touring back in the States some more, it comes back to London again. And then finally, in the late 1860s, it goes to Paris as well, right? Becomes this celebration of American art and American landscape. Right? Everybody's awed by it, not only by the picture itself, but also by Niagara Falls, right? So that means it comes to London when Cropsey's living there, because he moves there in 1856, right? And he sees this other painting by an American landscape painter making a bigger splash than he's making living there. So his picture, we think, is this sort of response. Right? I'm going to make sure that people realize, since I'm here, that I'm the guy you can come to for these sorts of things. Right? So he one-ups it in a way. It's not anywhere near as dramatic. It's not anywhere near as dangerous insofar as your viewpoint is concerned. Right? It's more kind of like Durand with the sort of gentle move down into the landscape. But it's bigger. And the drama comes from something else. The sun coming out from behind the clouds, the foliage of upstate New York, which people still get in their cars and drive to, right? In the fall, right? Foliage trips. You go see the leaves as they turn because it's so spectacular out here, right? I'm from Oregon. We get nice colors, but boy, not even like what you get. Go to Frederick and see it in October, you know? And he even tells us, Cropsey does, that this is supposed to be October, right? And when he puts it on display in London, it's a monster hit. Some people say, those colors can't be real. And other people would come up to me, I've been to America, I know it's real, right? Leaves do that in upstate New York, right? Have this blast of color in the winter, or early fall. And it sort of bucked the tradition for images of the fall, because the fall is the end of the harvest, leaves are dying, trees are becoming bare for the winter, that images of autumn in European art were usually looked at images of death. And Cropsey presents it as an image of glory, of celebration, of this explosion of color. It was such a big hit, Cropsey's picture was, that he ended up getting introduced to the Queen because of the fame of the picture. Right? She wanted to meet the man who painted that. So it's pretty spectacular. Now, on certain levels, as we'll see in details, it's even more detailed than Thomas Cole, or Asher Durand for that matter. And part of this comes out of a friend he had made while living in London, John Ruskin. In mid-century England, there are very few people who are as influential as John Ruskin. Wrote about architecture, wrote about painting. Painter himself, not a bad one at that. Friends with a number of artists. In fact, Ruskin's wife ended up marrying John Everett Millais. He left him for the other painter. But in the 1840s, he had written this book called Modern Painters, which was not only an assessment of where painting was at this time in the 1840s, but also was a manual on how to paint. In fact, he's got a really great book you can find for like $5 on drawing, on how to draw. Ruskin's drawing manual. I got a copy at home. It's fantastic. And in both of them, what he recommends for painters, this is the most. You've got to get out in nature, he says. You've got to draw from direct observation. You have to immerse yourself in nature, right? What's his line? Walk with her, with nature, having no other thoughts but how to best penetrate her meaning and remembering her instruction, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing. In other words, try to be as objective as you can and draw it as well as you can. And one of the things when I was reading his drawing, he says what you should try to do as you're studying nature and observing it as the artist, right, is you should be thinking very directly as you're making the mark. You should be thinking about how it grows. So if you're going to draw a leaf, your mark making should be an analogy for the growth patterns. As you're drawing the bark of the tree, you should be thinking about how that tree grew up and bent as it followed sunlight, or was pushed by the wind, or broken. And think about drawing not just as capturing an essence or something like that, but as truly understanding the thing you're looking at, as a mode of investigation. Is that how we think about art? As a mode of investigation? We tend not to, right? We think of it as a mode of expression. But Ruskin is very much about art as a mode of thinking, right? And so when he says rejecting nothing, remember the instruction of nature. Reject nothing, right? Don't throw it out because you don't like it. It's nature, it belongs. Reject nothing, select nothing. That does include everything, right? Scorn nothing. Don't look down on anything that you're looking at, right? Don't judge it. Now, Ruskin's friends with Cropsey, and Cropsey's picture really, in a nutshell, rejects nothing, selects nothing, and scorns nothing. We can identify all of the trees, the species of the trees, because of the depth of his observations that he'd been making already. Right? Let's look at some of the details. I really like this picture a lot. It's because it's really charming, right? One of the things Cropsey likes to do in the pure landscapes, the spirit of the war is this weird early thing, right? Most of his landscapes are more like this. He'll give us a surrogate. He'll give us some way into the picture. Figures who are doing what we're doing, relaxing and watching the view, right? We can imagine ourselves being there, having a picnic like these huntsmen are. The closer we get, right, we can see they're smoking and drinking, and their dogs, they've been out on the hunt. They've got their guns stacked against the tree in the background, and the dogs are done working. So everybody's like, chill, right? It's Miller time. They're just relaxing at the end of the day, and they're enjoying this amazing view, having some bread and some wine with their nice little picnic set out, right? This establishes the mood for us. This is how we should be looking at this picture, right? We should be understanding it as one of my favorite words in the language, the halcyon days. You know the word halcyon days? Halcyon. There's these little, you know how, like, early August before you start thinking about coming back to school, right? And the days are really long and the air's kind of heavy and you've had the whole summer to sort of get out of the whole school mode. You're just like, this is great, and the days kind of seem longer, you know. Those are the halcyon days where you actually do have time to not do anything for a while, you know, to just enjoy time passing and be unaware of how much time has passed and not really worried about that. You know, and as I get older, I don't even have that in the summer, but that's what they have, right? They're enjoying this moment. That's not a moment at all, right? It's the long passage of time in October. Great details everywhere. Really sharply observed. The dog playing in the water in the lake that you can't even see in the larger picture, right down to the edge there. And you know, I like dogs, so I always find an excuse to show them to you, right? And this sets the stage for really what's going on in the landscape. There's no drama, right? Everybody seems to be totally in harmony with nature. The fact that we've got huntsmen who are supposed to be out there killing things, they don't have any dead things around them, and they're not actively hunting either, right? That suggests, again, that they put aside their desire to invade nature and have just instead are just enjoying it. And moving into this colorful landscape, we see a path that begins somewhere over that bluff, leads across a rickety wooden bridge, and then back through a ravine as it bends back through that ravine, and then rises up a hill, and we see a man on a horse. Right? All of these things are meant to guide us through the landscape. And again, keep in mind the size of this, that you do this sort of armchair travel, right? You work your way through the landscape. I love the kids on the bridge with their puppy, right? Looking down at the water running by. Ask this question again. Bridges over water, right? Is this also then a metaphor? The passage of time, life and its phases. Is the move through the landscape that we see meant to make us reflect on our own passage through life? I should mention, by the way, if we go back a slide, the dog's barking at those cows, right? There's some cows just like meandering ankle deep in the water, and the dog on the other side of that branch outcrop is actually angry at the cows, right? And dogs do this. Right? I had a dog once I trained that it would bark at the word cow, because every time we were driving in Oregon and he was in the back of the station wagon, he'd be asleep. I'd say, Hugo, cow! And he would just immediately perk up and start barking, because I did it once and he saw them. That's what dogs do, right? So anyway, there we are with our people on the bridge. And then as we move our way through the landscape, there's this figure going over the rise of the bridge. Is that another figure between the trees? Coming at him? No, that's just... But again, these are the colors that people said couldn't be accurate. And anybody who had been upstate had said, yeah, yes, they are. That's exactly how it looks. But it's all about sort of, right, our horse isn't rearing up like we saw in Thomas Cole. There's no danger. There's no imposing things coming. Houses are nestled amid the trees. It's a log cabin, no less, right? We've taken things from nature, but we've built something in harmony with it, right? There. And as we work our way back, we find this cute little town, not encroaching into nature, but hugging right on the edge of the bank of the river, where they can do business with the boats that come and go, right? This is mankind totally in harmony, and certainly not the sort of Thomas Cole style of us ruining everything by our presence. Cropsey returned to the States in 1863 and continued to paint. He kept a home on the Hudson River where he would go out and do sketches directly from his home studio and then go back. He started off living in New York, and now he's living out there. Greenwood Lake is in New Jersey and was a subject matter that for Cropsey had really great resonance. The very first landscape paintings he ever exhibited I believe it was at the American Art Union in 1843. His first public exhibition were 2 pictures of Greenwood Lake. So here he is 30 years later, returning to the same theme. And in fact, he really never gave it up, right? It remained a very important theme for him. And in this particular picture, we can see him sort of recalling early success. We also know that it was important for him because this is where he actually met his wife, was at Greenwood Lake. So it has all of these sort of personal references and resonances for Cropsey. Same devices we saw in Autumn on the Hudson. People as our surrogates, giving us the mood, establishing the way to approach the landscape. They're on a rock so they can see, but it's not particularly dangerous in any way. They seem to be out for a unlaborious afternoon stroll. Appears they've got picnic goods with them, another dog, and just absolutely relaxing and enjoying this landscape where very little happens, and what does happen doesn't happen quickly. Right? I think that behind us on the left is probably the house they came from, right? There's nobody around the house. There's a little garage or barn outside, and the path leads this direction. So since they're on this side of the lake, I'm assuming that that's their house. We're supposed to sort of think about it that way. And they've stepped out of the house and here to this promontory to have this wonderful view over the lake. And they look to the other side, and there's another little house also beautifully nestled on a gentle slope. People on that side also communing with nature, going down to the side of the lake to jump into a boat. As we look down on our side, we see the pier, so it's certainly a back and forth area for transit across this large lake. And I love the 2 guys that are leaning up against the post and just killing time. Right? Again, this is a large-ish picture, about 4.5 feet across, nowhere near as big as the other one. So our detail here is just about 2 strokes of paint to capture that man in the blue shirt sleeves leaning against the post and the man in red, presumably man in red, sitting there talking to him, and the others in the sailboat either just arriving or about to depart. Okay. Everything's languid. Nothing happens fast. Even the steamboat doesn't seem to be, racing. It's leaving a bit of a wake, so it's moving somewhat more quickly than the sailboat can move. Maybe the sailboat's waiting for the wake to die down before it departs, right? But it still is a landscape that's quiet and slow. And as you look at it, you appreciate the opportunity to let time pass without being pushed to do something else. I wanted to point to a couple things here that I think is going on. You'll notice this area right in here. What's going on with the paint there? And over here. Yeah, I think it's a little bit, well, those 2 for sure, right? I'm pretty sure that's conservation. The one on the right looks very much like a rip in the canvas that has been fixed by our paintings conservator. You see part of it still there. And this is a viable career path, a difficult one, but a viable one, where you can take your art history degree plus some knowledge of painting, studio art, plus some knowledge of chemistry, and work toward a degree in paintings. And what they try to do is to make it so that it still looks good for you and me, right? But also that if you look closely enough, you can see what they've done, right? And they usually will do it in a different medium so it can be cleaned off easily without touching Cropsey's paint, right? Again, the impact of Dutch art. We've mentioned this a number of times. Dutch Baroque art has a huge impact on American painting, particularly landscape painting, but also portrait painting in the 19th century. And that comes again from shared issues, shared historical circumstance, right? What happened to Holland in the 17th century was happening to America in the 19th century. And so I just brought this one out of many I could have brought in, but it's the same sort of thing. It's a waterway where we move from one side with the pier to the far side, and we see the people in this unhurried kind of commute, enjoying the time as it passes slowly. These gents on the harbor here mirror, in a certain level, the small details we saw in Cropsey's harbor, where they're just simply relaxing as time passes slowly. Our last Hudson River School painter is the one we've talked about 2 or 3 times now, Frederick Church, right? Frederick Edwin Church. He actually studied under Thomas Cole. Thomas Cole, as I said at the beginning of class, is really the father of landscape painting in America. People like Cropsey just worshiped the ground he walked on, but he also taught painters, and Frederick Edwin Church was his pupil in the 40s, probably his single most prominent pupil just before he passed away. And what Church did after studying under Cole was to travel extensively looking for dramatic subjects. As you might imagine, having studied under Cole and learning his approach to landscape, which was melodramatic, right? Precipitous, that Church then went looking for sites where he could apply what he learned under Cole. This is what brought him to Niagara Falls, right? And puts him on the brink, is that interest, what he learned from Cole. And it took him twice to South America, looking for dramatic subjects, right? Central and South America. The first time he goes, 1853. Second time, 1857. Both times, Frederick Church is going to make sketches. And he brings the sketches back to New York, back to his studio, and it's there that he composes the scenes. So our picture here on the left, Tamaka Palms, is 3 feet across the base. Still a bit too big to be doing it outside, right? And painted in the studio based on sketches he had made in South America. Now, his trip to South America was inspired by his readings. There was a German naturalist. Back up a bit. After Darwin, right, and his travels and his interest in natural science, really began a period mid-19th century where a number of people became deeply interested in natural science. And it began, because of Darwin, we have other branches of science begin. And one of these was geography. Just an interest in, okay, if man has evolved, what about the planet? What about the rocks? How have they evolved, right? And so in the 1850s, the field of geography is relatively new, right? And we have a number of people who begin to investigate geology, become interested in it. And one of them was this German naturalist named Alexander von Humboldt. And his works were published and then translated, and Church owned a copy of Humboldt's writings. And Humboldt traveled through South America. And when Humboldt went to South America, he commented on the fact that the icy mountains, the deserts, the rainforest, that these were all evidence of divine harmony in nature. And that if we study them enough, and particularly things like volcanoes, we can determine the age of the earth. We can see earth in how it came to be. They were signs of creation in the modern world. And Church owns a copy of this, and he pockets it, and he uses it on his travels. And when he goes to South America, he uses it as his Baedeker's guide, his travel guide, right? It's his Lonely Planet, right? And he literally traces Humboldt's steps from place to place through South America, hoping to document the things that Humboldt wrote about, hoping to make painted versions of them, right? So he's going to record it in meticulous sketches, in drawings, and in oil sketches. And then he'll go back to New York with this encyclopedia of ideas and cobble together these pictures when he gets back. So in this particular case, he was interested in this particular species of palm tree, the Tamaka species of palm trees. And he paints it in exacting detail, right? Botanists say this is spot on back in the studio. And he's paying attention to tons of other kinds of foliage as well while he's in South America. And he comes back and paints these. And of course, for the landscape market, they're exotic, right? They allow you to see something you couldn't see in your everyday life. And in addition to making these detailed drawings of the flora and the fauna, he also makes drawings of cultural traditions, right? So this is the kind of boat they used there. This is the kind of clothing they wore. This is the sort of thing that they did. These are the sorts of houses that you would see. Everything is based on direct observation, meticulous observation, and brought back into the compositions, right? And cobbled together. He's, again, not trying to give you a sense of particular place, but rather trying to evoke an experience that is, in fact, accurate in its detail. Okay, we'll finish off church on Tuesday and move on from there. I think we're on the schedule that's on Canvas, right? Your revised things due today if you haven't already turned it in. And yeah, I think that's it. And then what I need to, those of you who I haven't had a meeting with yet, you need to set that up with me, right? To talk about your painting so we know where you're headed with it as we move our way toward that assignment that's due next week, Friday. Okay? So put that on your radar screen. And we already talked. Okay? I knew you were looking at me like, and since we did it in advance and leading up to choosing it, so we're good. Okay? It's like a bundle of ideas.
Yeah. Because I got an email from my supervisor and she had a couple of questions.
Okay.
She's working on a few new projects and she was wondering if there's anybody at Marymount. She needs an animation judge for an upcoming exhibit. Just basically what question is any factory help with this. I'm also looking for light artists for a Maine Light Festival.
Light artists. Okay, yes, I do. Light artists, they should talk to David Carlson. He's done light installations before,
Okay.
right? And you've had classes with him.
I actually have not had it.
You've not had him. Okay, if you want me to ask him, then send me that email from her and I will send it on to David Carlson and see if he's got the time or not. He's on the Arlington Arts Council, so I don't know how he's sitting with free time and whatnot, right? But I know that one of the things he did last year was a light installation in, I want to say, Silver Spring, in a sort of a plaza there on handrails and whatnot. And he's been working a lot with video projection lately, so he might be the right person for that.
Okay.
Insofar as the other one, which was illustration, right? A judge
That was
for
for
animation. We don't really do time here,
Yeah,
right?
I was
But
hesitant, but I thought I'd ask anyway.
yeah, who does? The only person that you might ask would be the chair of media design to see if he knows anybody that they might have somebody that works with motion, because they do something with motion graphics, right? In media design, they have a class of motion graphics, and it might be taught by an adjunct, but that might be just the right person. So again, if you forward it to me, I'll forward it to Barry, because I don't know. Do you know Barry Earljohn? Have you had him? Okay, I didn't think so. So I can certainly help you put both of those into the right ballpark, right? And it may or may not be what she's wants, but at least we're giving them something.
Yeah, she was just wondering since I'm around.
Yeah. So that's great.
I'll forward it to you.
Good. See you soon.